Before it disappeared, it was everywhere. On breakfast tables, in grocery aisles, and in homes across generations. A familiar face tied to something as simple as pancakes, yet carrying a story most people never stop to question. It looked comforting, even ordinary, but behind it was a history shaped by entertainment, real lives, and shifting cultural values over more than a century. So what exactly was Aunt Jemima meant to represent? And why did something so widely recognized eventually fade away? Today, we're diving into that question, right here, on History of Simple Things. Aunt Jemima began not as a person, but as a product. In 1888, two men, Chris Rutt and Charles Underwood, created one of the first ready-mix pancake flours through their company, the Pearl Milling Company in Missouri. At the time, this was a major innovation because it made cooking pancakes faster and easier. However, the product initially struggled to sell, and the founders realized they needed a recognizable identity to stand out. In 1889, they chose the name Aunt Jemima, inspired by a popular minstrel song from that era. This decision would shape the brand's identity for over a century, tying it directly to entertainment culture of the time rather than just food. The character of Aunt Jemima was based on a figure known as the Mammy, a stereotype rooted in American slavery. This image portrayed a black woman as a loyal, cheerful domestic worker who cared for white families. It was commonly used in minstrel shows, where performers exaggerated racial features and behaviors for entertainment. The original Aunt Jemima reflected this stereotype, often shown wearing a headscarf, apron, and a broad smile. While it may have been seen as friendly or comforting at the time, the character was built on a distorted and romanticized view of slavery that ignored its harsh realities. Over time, this association would become one of the most criticized aspects of the brand. Although Aunt Jemima was fictional, a real woman helped bring the character to life. Her name was Nancy Green, a formerly enslaved woman who became the first public face of Aunt Jemima at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. She cooked pancakes, told stories, and portrayed the character as part of a marketing campaign. This made her one of the first black corporate spokespersons in American history. However, the role required her to act out a scripted version of the stereotype, reinforcing the image that the brand wanted to sell. After her death, other women continued to portray Aunt Jemima at events and promotions, showing how the character was treated as a role rather than a real identity. As the brand changed ownership, its popularity grew rapidly. The R.T. Davis Milling Company purchased the product and expanded its marketing, eventually renaming itself Aunt Jemima Mills in 1914. Later, the Quaker Oats Company acquired the brand in 1925, turning it into a household name across the United States. Over the decades, Aunt Jemima became one of the most recognizable food brands, appearing not just on pancake mix, but also on syrup, frozen waffles, and other breakfast products. Advertisements featured different women playing the role, and the character became deeply embedded in American culture, even as its origins remained largely unquestioned by the general public. By the mid-20th century, attitudes toward race and representation began to shift, and the Aunt Jemima image started to face criticism. In response, the company made several changes to modernize the character's appearance. In 1968, the headscarf was replaced with a headband, and her features were softened. Later updates in 1989 gave her a more contemporary look, removing the head covering entirely and adding pearl earrings. These changes were attempts to move away from the original stereotype while keeping the brand recognizable. However, critics argued that altering the image did not address the deeper issue, which was the character's origin in a racially insensitive caricature. In 2020, renewed global conversations about racial justice brought increased attention to brands with problematic histories. The company behind Aunt Jemima, owned by PepsiCo, acknowledged that the character was based on a racial stereotype and decided to retire the name and image. In 2021, the brand was officially reintroduced as the Pearl Milling Company, returning to the name of the original business that created the pancake mix over a century earlier. While the products themselves remained largely the same, the rebranding aimed to separate them from the history tied to the old identity. This marked the end of Aunt Jemima as a brand identity, closing a chapter that had lasted more than 130 years. Aunt Jemima was never just a person, but a symbol shaped by history, business, and culture. What began as a marketing strategy turned into one of the most recognizable brand figures in the world, yet it was built on ideas that no longer align with modern values. The story of Aunt Jemima shows how something familiar can carry a deeper meaning that changes over time, especially as society begins to question what once went unchallenged. Today, the name may be gone, but the conversation it sparked continues, reminding us that even everyday objects can have histories worth understanding, and that those histories don't stay fixed. They change depending on how we choose to see them. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.